don't have any idea
Fair enough.
how an alien, civilization would think. With the only mode of thinking that we know, even among other animals, is from this one biological line that happened to have grown up on Earth. And if you go back to the Cambrian explosion, we're all descendants of one sort of tetrapod that managed to make it out of that. If hallucigenica had been the creature that had made it through the Cambrian explosion instead of us, I guarantee you, relationships among people on this planet would be very, very different, and we'd look a whole lot different.
Okay, let alone even just our appearance.
Yeah, we would think and act differently. And even that, is something that comes back to the same last common ancestor as we have. Something coming from a completely different biology, I suspect would just be completely incomprehensible to us.
Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, Edward Ashton returned to the show. Edward is a science fiction writer and the author of numerous novels, including Mickey 7, which became the basis for the movie Mickey 17, and he's now back to discuss his new book, After the Fall. After the Fall is a delightful and thought-provoking novel about a post-apocalyptic Earth where an alien civilization has settled on our planet and domesticated humans. Ed and I had a chance to talk about the origins of After the Fall, as well as the nature of domestication and how we think about it, and maybe how we should think about it. We discussed the ambiguous nature of the book's future history, and even how we might think about human mediocrity, the great filter, and humanity's self-destructive possibilities. This conversation was a lot of fun, and I had a great time speaking with Ed. Let's jump in. Ed, welcome back to the Orthogonal Bet. So good to be talking with you again. Excited to chat about your new book, After the Fall, which is a ton of fun. I really enjoyed it. I definitely want to talk about some of the ideas in the book, but maybe the best place to start is just with kind of the origin. So maybe if you could explain a little bit of the story itself and then sort of the story behind the story, that might be a great place to begin.
Sure. So this book is set in an indeterminate future on Earth. Something bad has happened. There's been a sort of an apocalypse. About 99.9% of all humanity has been destroyed. Almost everybody's dead. There's also been an alien invasion of sorts. The few survivors have been subjugated by the aliens, who are now sort of clinging to a foothold on Earth. And they're kept as somewhere between slaves and pets. And as you might imagine from that intro, it's kind of a lighthearted book that centers around an effort to get a new bed and breakfast off the ground. So that's sort of the setup for it. As far as where this came from, the origins of the story, I had a dog. I had a dog named Max, and he was my best friend. For 17 years, he was my best friend. He went everywhere with me. If I was sitting down to watch television, he was immediately flopped across my lap. He followed me everywhere I went. When I lost my mother some years ago, it was me and Max who disappeared into the woods for 12 hours and we just walked.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And then, as happens with dogs, he got old and we lost him a few years ago. And that got me thinking about our relationship, because he meant so much to me, and I knew what that relationship was from my end. But I started to wonder, what did our relationship look like to him?
Mm-hmm.
Because, I thought him I always called him my best friend, but there was such a power differential between us. Everything that happened between us was in my control, not his. And can that really be a friendship? Can you really be anything real when there's such a huge power differential between the two of you? And so that's the idea that I really wanted to explore with this book.
Wow. No, that's so interesting to hear. And one of the things you touch upon, and yeah, to reiterate what you're saying, you're right, despite sort of the heavy topics and kind of the heavy background, it is this kind of silly, light book for the most part, which is kind of interesting. But related to domestication. Domestication is this process that humanity has been doing for tens of thousands of years, I guess. This is, and I feel like I remember one person who I know mentioning that almost one of the most sophisticated technologies we've ever developed are dogs, because we made them what they are. The wolf is very different than the dog, even if physically they might kind of appear the same. Certainly mentally they're kind of very, very different. And we've bred them into a kind of certain state. And there's a certain element of that, and I guess maybe I'm spoiling some parts of the book, not quite,
But like domestication is a process. And so when you're thinking about either dogs or kind of humans or kind of domesticated, how do you kind of think about that process and what it makes the thing, like the creature that is being domesticated?
Well, it's a process that we like to think, I think, that we do to other creatures. It's not. It is a process that happens between creatures all the time. I think if you were an
You mean
alien
like in
who
terms
sort
of some sort of like coevolutionary kind of thing?
yeah, it's
Right.
it's a symbiotic relationship. So, like I said, if you were an alien who just sort of popped into this world and took a look around, one of the first things you might conclude is, wheatgrasses have domesticated this breed of giant ape. It's really impressive what they've done. They've gotten these apes to spread them all across the world. It's really that's some impressive technology. They'd really want to talk to the wheat and figure out how they pulled this off. You have ants that domesticate aphids.
Right. Yeah.
We have worked with a number of different species, obviously, and allied ourselves. One of the ways that I think about sort of my household is you've got these, violent carnivorous apes who look around and say, you know what, there's two other really great clades of dangerous predators on this planet. There's the wolves and there's the big cats. Let's team up with them. All three of us, let's get together and just terrorize the whole rest of the planet. And that's basically what we've done.
That is a very different way of thinking about it. Oh, that's super interesting. And I guess domestication, and I think we discussed it a little bit in our last conversation. So there's like the David Brin novels, like the uplift novels, where where it's like different species are kind of uplifting to sapiens, different species. And domestication is a very different sort of process, even if there's kind of this like symbiotic kind of thing. Like, how would you kind of distinguish? I mean, how would you? I'm not even sure if define is the right word. Like, how do you distinguish those kinds of processes or define kind of domestication here in terms of how to, especially given, in your novel, the humans are still they're still like totally like sapient, like they're still like the same level of intelligence as far as I can tell, but there's been this domesticating process. Like, so how do you kind of think about that?
Well, I think I would argue that dogs are probably at least as intelligent, if not more so, than wolves. But the domestication process is, and again, it's a co-evolution where they are growing to be more like us, to be more useful to us, to be something that we can live with. You couldn't live with a pack of wolves. You bring gray wolves to hang out in your house, and things are going to go very, very badly, very, very quickly. As you say, a dog, particularly a big dog, like my dogs couldn't hurt anything, but like, you look at an Irish wolfhound, and if it took it into its head to do bad things to you, it could certainly do it, but it doesn't do it because we've not just changed them physically, we've changed them mentally. We've changed the levels of aggression that they have. We've changed the way that they interact with us. I mean, dogs, it's been demonstrated, are able to read our facial expressions with almost as much facility as we are. A dog can look at your face and determine, is he happy or is he sad or is he angry? Very, very quick, because they have to be able to do that. They have to be able to read those nonverbal communications in order to, to live with us, in order to not get into trouble, in order to not do things that we don't want them to do. And that's, those are mental changes, which have nothing to do with the physical changes that they've undergone. And, if you look at the wide range of dogs, some of them we've made smaller and, less threatening than a wolf. But, things like mastiffs and wolfhounds, they're actually bigger and heavier than natural wolves, and probably more dangerous in a lot of ways, certainly on an individual basis. If I had to fight, I wouldn't want to fight any. I'm not one of these idiots who's like, I could fight a gorilla. But if I had to fight something, I would probably rather fight a gray wolf than an English mastiff.
Interesting. Okay. Right. And I mentioned,
so we bred them in different directions.
Yeah, and I mentioned before, you guys, like the mental differences, but you're right, like physical difference. Like we've created this like whole menagerie of things that are all the same species, but wildly different. And yeah, I guess actually you were talking about recognizing like being able to read facial expressions. I'm not a dog owner, so I don't know these details, but like, presumably a lot of people who have dogs, they can read the expressions of their dogs as well very well. Is it one of these things where humans have gotten good at this kind of thing, or we've gain that facility, or that perhaps dogs, like there has been kind of this breeding selection process to kind of make the expressions of dogs more human-like, more easily readable? Is there something there as well in terms of like being able to actually read the mental states as well?
I think, again, it's a matter of coevolution. We've been allied with dogs for 30,000 years. That's a long time. That's a lot of generations. And we've grown up with them the same way that they've grown up with us. Dogs, dogs are a part of, so far as I know, almost every human society on the planet and have been for a very, very long time. And so even if you're not a dog owner, you certainly interact with dogs. You've seen dogs, you've seen your friends' dogs, you've seen dogs in the park. You're going for a jog and you see a dog who's not on leash. You're reading his expressions really quickly and you're probably doing it effectively. At a glance, is that dog going to come after me? Or can I just jog on by and I'm fine? And that's something that you would not be able to read that kind of intention off of a jaguar, for instance, or a puma, because you haven't had this coevolution with them.
Yeah, and then this is also one of these things where not only reading the expressions, but I wonder if to a certain degree, and and this also kind of relates to like how people write about like extraterrestrial species and aliens and things like that, is that presumably the mental states of many animals are wildly alien to us, but oftentimes,
for sure.
But like the domesticated ones, there has been this smoothing process to kind of make the mental states far less alien.
Yeah. And as some of that is probably illusory on our part. A lot of the reactions that we see in cats in particular, who are they've only been with us for about 5,000 years. And you can make an argument again that cats have domesticated us much more than we have domesticated them. There are a lot of things that we read into cat behavior that we think, she loves me. She thinks I'm great. She likes to hang out with me when, people who really know cat behavior will say, no, she thinks that you're an idiot cat who's incompetent at hunting. The reason she's leaving mice on your door is because she thinks you're going to starve to death because you're a moron who can't hunt, and she's trying to help you out. I think we can misinterpret things when we try to humanize animals more than is really warranted.
Oh, it's super interesting. And so related to the aliens that end up colonizing Earth and domesticating the humans in your novel, The Greys, they in many ways have at least the story is narrated by a human, but you kind of see at least some of kind of the thought processes, and certainly the Grey Bartok, who is kind of bonded with the main character, or vice versa. I'm probably using, but the one who basically owns the main character, he seems like kind of this goofy, very understandable human being, even though obviously he is very, very different. That being said, one of the features of these aliens is something that actually is kind of like very much the opposite of like the domestication kind of thing, like this idea of absenting. I don't know if you can kind of talk about that and was that, presumably that was introduced, one, because it's interesting, but also to kind of show that there are ways when mental states become very, very alien, very, very different, and extremely non-domesticated.
Yes. And so when I sort of create an alien creature, I usually start with some model of a creature that I know. And that I can build on it. I don't like take a tiger and put him on two legs and say, there's my alien, that's kind of weak in my opinion. But, I do always start with a model. And the model I started with the Greys was the elephant.
Okay. That was in my mind. That was sort of the mental image. I had kind of like an elephant with some crest something kind of similar like that. Yeah.
But so, bull elephants, you're probably aware, have a really interesting, elephants really intelligent. Very, very smart creatures, very empathetic. They're shown to have culture, and different elephant groupings behave in different ways, the same way that different human groupings do. But bull elephants have this state that they enter called must, which you may or may not have read about, where they become very unintelligent and incredibly aggressive. And, a bull elephant in must is the most dangerous thing on the African continent. They will attack anything. They'll fight each other. They'll fight hippos. They're famous actually for just randomly murdering hippos. Bull elephants in must will just find hippos and just literally beat them to death. And really nobody else messes with hippos. Hippos are very scary animals themselves. And so that was the process that I was modeling with absenting. So you have these creatures which are intelligent and cultured and have very actually exquisite self-control for the most part until they enter this state. And it is a biological switch that flips, and they become incredibly violent, incredibly dangerous. And that obviously that's something that I did because it is very useful for driving my plot. But again, it was based on a biological model that I was pretty familiar with.
That's so fascinating. And yeah, I don't think I was familiar with the extent of this kind of feature of bull elephants. And I guess, and related to that, has there been a study, or has there been work on understanding why that persists in people elephants? Like, is there some sort of evolutionary advantage? I mean, it could just be some sort of like vestigial kind of thing. And then also, how did you think about how that kind of thing would transfer to a civilization with a species kind of that actually has this kind of like this sort of absenting, this kind of going crazy, or at least like losing some sort of mental capacity as a feature of an entire civilization?
Yeah. I mean, with elephants, it's related to mating.
Okay.
As most stupid things that most animals do are related to mating, has been my observation.
Okay.
In terms of the grays that I sort of created for this book, this has a profound effect on their society. It affects their laws. You can't be held liable for anything that happens when you're absent. You can do anything. Yeah, anything. You can murder a dozen people while you're absent, and you are not legally liable because there is no. And yeah, obviously, that's not a feature that we have in any human laws or humans. That's not something we would ever think about. It's like, wow, he's really mad. We can't punish him for killing all those people. That's, because again, it's a biological thing. It's not really an emotional thing for them. And it relates directly to how they interact with each other. They are hyper polite because you never want to take the risk of pushing someone to absent. So in their interactions with each other, they're always careful. They're always polite. And the way I spilled that over into the interactions with humans is sort of humans are someplace where they can let that go and not be so polite. And that's one of the reasons why some of them are so cruel to humans, because here's somebody that I can vent on and I don't have to worry about them going absent and like destroying me.
Mm-hmm.
So we sort of serve as punching bags for them to a certain extent.
And do you have a sense, how much did you think about like the domestication process by the grays of the humans as kind of fulfilling that sort of societal need for the grays to be able to just have this sort of pressure release, or however we want to describe it?
I don't think they would have ever consciously thought of it that way, but we do a lot more things subconsciously than we do consciously. It's a truism that's been demonstrated by imaging studies and by lots of other stuff, that the human brain, your sort of neocortex, is not a decision-making tool. It's a rationalization tool.
Yeah.
All of your decisions are made by your lizard brain buried somewhere back in the back of your skull. And all this gray matter up here does is justify those decisions that have already been made. And that's why, for instance, really intelligent people are much more susceptible to things like cults, to joining cults, because they use their great intelligence to justify this crazy, crazy stuff that that the leader is telling them. Whereas somebody who's maybe a little more, a little more slow-witted hears that stuff and like they can't come up with, okay, I have no reasonable explanation for why I said this is just crazy, I have to leave. A really smart person can come up with some, 4-dimensional chess reason why, but I really should like wear this robe and go into the basement and drink all that cyanide. That makes total sense now that I've explained it to myself.
Oh boy. Yeah. that is quite depressing.
Making people depressed is one of my best things. That's sort of a skill of mine.
Well done. Yeah. And so I guess also in terms of like the world building for the novel, it's all kind of set in this setting where, I mean, humanity is almost entirely gone, and kind of the world is like Earth has a lot of issues, and we are, as the title says, like after the fall. That being said, the nature of the destruction, kind of the ordering of like, did the grays kind of cause this kind of thing? Like, what, like, was it they kind of mopping up after humans? Like, it's all kind of left vague. Did you leave it vague even for yourself, or was there kind of a better, like a more detailed kind of story in your own head for kind of what really happened there?
Oh, I know what happened. Yeah, I know what happened. Leaving it vague was a deliberate choice, and it's one that I thought about very carefully.
Okay.
And the reason that I did it that way was because I wanted to really emphasize the point that it doesn't matter. There's one of the things that I have a real problem with in our world today is people justifying doing awful things right now because somebody else did something awful 8 generations ago. And like my distant ancestor was a victim of this thing 8 generations ago. So now I can do something awful back to you. And I don't think that's helpful. I don't think that's productive for anybody, because, you can keep stretching back and back and back, and everybody was awful and everybody was a victim if you go back far enough. Like I'm Swedish by extraction, and my distant ancestors did some of the most awful things that anybody could ever do in the ninth and 10th centuries. But they also had a bunch of bad stuff done to them both earlier and later. And yeah, I think that's true for almost everybody. And so I wanted to make it so that nobody was really sure whose fault everything was at the beginning. And you really just have to deal with the situation as it stands today. And that was, like I said, that was a deliberate design choice on my part.
Okay. No, that's really powerful, right? Because I feel like one, sometimes even just like as a reader or kind of like someone experienced story, you want to know all the different details. But I agree with you that no matter what the details are, like the world is as given, and you still have to make the right choices and kind of figure out the right way to operate, even in a kind of messy, uncertain world. Right, independent of whose fault it was, this generation or the previous one, or you can kind of go back for these kind of tit for tat kind of things. And so, and I guess, and one of the interesting things in the book is also, and related to that, is the extent to which, on the one hand, humans can justifiably blame the Greys for domesticating them, and like that, and that they kind of know that's happened, whether or not their world was destroyed for them. But at the same time, though, not all, like, just because that happened doesn't necessarily mean that therefore there are not Greys who are actually trying to rectify the situation. You begin to kind of see that there are different factions in that world. Like, it's not this kind of monolithic sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And is that, I mean, I guess, and there's a number of, and because you were mentioning about like power dynamics and things like that, you mentioned that the origins of this book were just kind of in terms of like thinking about the relationship. It originated with like you and your dog, and kind of thinking about it like from like the perspective of your dog as well, and kind of these power imbalances. But there's obviously like parables and metaphors that are like there's also, I mean, it could be discussing certain things around like the history of slavery, or even, I have no idea if you were kind of thinking about going forward with like super intelligent AI, how it will think about humanity. Like, what were the other different, like, were there any other kind of things from either our future concerns, past things about history that you're kind of drawing upon as you're kind of thinking about this?
Yeah, anytime I'm putting a book together, I'm always pulling in different threads from different things. And it's mostly things that have bothered me or obsessed me over long periods of time. There's always sort of a core idea. And for me, that was this idea of power imbalance. And most of my books are based around a core relationship, because to me, the most important thing is relationships among people. If you look at my Mickey 7 books, those books are about the relationship between Mickey and Nasha. There's all kinds of other stuff going on there, but that's what it's about. This book is about the relationship between Martok and John. If you want to get down to it, it's how they negotiate that relationship, how it changes over the course of the book as they come to understand more about one another. But you can't make an interesting novel just on something like that. You got to have all the other stuff brought in there as well. And I'm always interested in commenting on social dynamics. There obviously are some very complex social dynamics here. I don't want to make any direct analogies between the relationships between Greys and humans, and any relationships between different human groups here on our planet. But I do think it's sort of a funhouse mirror look at the way that we have sometimes interacted with each other. And if it makes people think a little bit about, maybe we shouldn't have interacted in some of the ways that we have interacted in the past, that might be a useful thing.
Yeah, no, and I think this is what the best science fiction does, where it's like, it might be kind of like an extended sort of thought experiment, not necessarily because it's a perfect parallel to anything, but it kind of highlights certain ways that maybe we should expand our thinking on. And so, yeah, I mean, and plus it can also be a very good story, and it should be a very good story as well, I guess. And actually, so your previous book, The Fourth Consort, also had a lot of things related to kind of, and then we discussed like ideas around like colonialism, and this one is much more around domestication. And these are clearly like both ways that alien species and civilizations have kind of imposed themselves on humans. Like, how would you kind of, I mean, I don't really know if comparing them or grading them and kind of like which one is better or worse, but like, I mean, how do you kind of think about if we were to interact with a truly alien other? Like, what is kind of the likelihood of different ways that we would be subjugated, be interacted with?
That's really a tough question, because we don't have any idea
Fair enough.
how an alien civilization would think. With the only mode of thinking that we know, even among other animals, is from this one biological line that happened to have grown up on Earth. And if you go back to the Cambrian explosion, we're all descendants of one sort of tetrapod that managed to make it out of that. if hallucigenica had been the creature that had made it through the Cambrian explosion instead of us, I guarantee you, relationships among people on this planet would be very, very different, and we'd look a whole lot different.
I would say, let alone even just our appearance.
Yeah, we would think and act differently. And even that, is something that comes back to the same last common ancestor as we have. Something coming from a completely different biology. I suspect would just be completely incomprehensible to us. The most interesting idea of that for me is, I don't know if you've ever read any of John Farley's early stuff, like the Ophiuchi Hotline.
I think you mentioned it. I unfortunately, I still have not read it.
So he presupposes aliens who are truly alien, so alien that we don't even recognize them as a life form, and they don't really recognize us as a life form either. They sort of see us as in the same category as ants or bees, maybe. Whereas, we see them basically as these sort of godlike entities that, that we can barely even comprehend their existence. And I kind of suspect if we ever actually interact with another sort of technological civilization, it's more likely to be like that. And I don't remember who it was that said that if we do find anything out there, we might find apes and we might find angels. We will not find men.
Yeah,
because
that's
the
interesting.
temporal window in which someone would be sort of on our level is so narrow.
Right. And so, there's always then, in storytelling, there's kind of always this balance of, okay, on the one hand, there's the likelihood of reality, and then there's the what does actually make for good storytelling, and you kind of always have to balance those kinds of things. That being said, though, I do think that one of the through lines of your writing is kind of this human mediocrity. I feel like not in terms of oh, we're bad. It's just more we are not when we engage with these civilizations, these extraterrestrial species and things like that, there is far from a guarantee that we will be the most powerful or most sophisticated or most moral. We're just sort of in the mix.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a fair guess. Is it? Why would we be special? Why should we be the smartest or the strongest or the most upright or anything else? I would expect the assumption of mediocrity is almost always a good one.
Right. It's sort of it's the Copernican principle, just expanded across everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You sort of, like I say, if you drive me in the middle of a room with 20 people and say, how many of these people do you think you could beat in one-on-one at basketball? Probably 10. I'm probably going to be about average if these people are randomly selected. It's always best to assume that you're mediocre, because most of the time you are.
I think of very, very fair and humbling way to think about this kind of thing. And I guess another thing I'm wondering is also in terms of how you aliens perhaps in reality might very well be entirely alien, and you can't really understand their motivations. In this novel, I'm just maybe you can share a little bit of kind of how you were thinking about the motivations of the Greys in terms of why they came to Earth, why they kind of decided to spend some time, and then even the domestication process. What was kind of, you see hints of it, but maybe you could share a little bit more kind of how you were the thinking behind what motivated the Grey civilization to even do any of this kind of thing.
Well, I mean, I think there is a basic drive that all life has to spread, right? I mean, look at people here on Earth right now talking about, we want to colonize Mars. I want to be the first person to get to Mars and build a city. Do you know how awful Mars is? Do you know what an absolute hole Mars is? How
spend time
miserable it would be.
The paradise of Antarctica, right? That's even that is.
Yeah. Antarctica would be a million times nicer place to live than Mars. Yeah. There's air. The dust won't literally poison you the instant you get a little bit of it into your lungs. But I think there is this fundamental desire to grow and to spread. If you have the technology, if a society develops technology to jump across the gap between stars, I think that they would do it, and that's what the Greys have done. I think we would do that if that becomes technologically feasible. I fully expect that we'll try and do it at some point. And so that's what they're doing. They're spreading. They're sort of, and they believe that they're spreading sort of the benefits and the glories of their civilization. They firmly believe that they have done us a huge favor by coming down and, taking care of us and saving us from our own idiocy. It's arguable whether that's true or not, but they firmly believe that they are on the right side of history here.
And so, related to human idiocy, whether or not we destroy ourselves or not in the story, there's this whole idea of the great filter with species and like whether or not like there's all these different things, especially technological filters that will kind of end civilizations and species and stuff like that. Like how do you think about that like where do you where is your thinking there in terms of like the great filter and the likelihood of humanity destroying itself?
I'm astounded that we're still here right now. That's, I from a quantum mechanics perspective, I'm kind of a believer in the multiverse, the multi-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, where everything that can happen will happen. So the fact that we could survive to this point means that in some worlds we did survive to this point. And then there's a sort of a psychological interpretation of that says that basically that your consciousness will follow a path through the multiverse where you continue to exist. This is also known as the quantum hell hypothesis, because that means that all of us are doomed to live to be 135 until we're tiny, decrepit shells begging desperately for death. But if that's the case, I would suspect that humanity still exists in only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of all the possible worlds out there. Because if you go back, we went through a near extinction event, 60,000 years ago. The best estimates, there were fewer than 2,000 humans left alive on the planet at that time. Like, we were an extremely endangered species with like nobody coming around to breed us in zoos to bring us back. The fact that we made it through that is amazing. In 1983, we came within one Soviet officer's basically decision to go against protocol of a flat out nuclear war, right? The Soviets, it was during a military exercise. I know you may or may not be familiar with this incident, but the Soviets, one of their radars basically malfunctioned and showed an incoming wave of American missiles. And the directive was to launch on warning. Yeah. And there was one particular guy, a colonel, who was like, you know what? I'm not going to do that. Wrong. I'm not going to end humanity. I'm going to wait and see what happens. And he waited, and like I said, it was a malfunction. And if there had been a different person sitting in that chair, I would guess of the 10 people who might have been there, probably 8 or 9 of them would have pushed the button because it was doctored. They were under orders to push the button in that circumstance, and he didn't do it. And that's the only reason you and I are sitting here. It's the only reason that we're not radioactive dust. So, like I said, I don't have great thoughts about our future, unless we get our stuff together pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the kind of the story you mentioned, I'm not sure I knew that one. I know other ones kind of very similar. I feel like, these are right. The fact that we now have like a whole catalog of those kinds of stories.
We've come close a bunch of times.
Humbling, yeah. And it's right. I think that one, the one you mentioned, if I remember correctly, right, I think one of the reasons he kind of realized something was off it was because it was like they were detecting like 8 missiles and it wasn't like one and it wasn't a huge number. And he's like, this seems kind of like a weird number. Like, this doesn't seem like the start of something. And so, it's, that's humbling, I guess, to realize. And so, okay. So, so you're very much of the opinion of like, we should have like the fact that we're still here is kind of this unexpected gift.
It's an anomaly. Yeah. It's an anomaly. And I don't want to be like a doom and gloom person. I'm not saying we're doomed to extinction in the next 20 minutes. I don't think that's necessarily true. But I do think the great filter hypothesis for why we don't see like alien civilizations all out in the stars is I think it's a plausible one.
And I guess you mentioned that one of the reasons you wrote this book was around trying to kind of think about the like you mentioned like having a dog, having this experience from your perspective, and like imagining what it would be like from that. Like how is that changed? Like after writing the book, like how has that changed how you interact with animals? Has the book writing process kind of altered that, kind of given you a different sort of insight, or was that really just kind of the jumping off?
I mean, I don't think so. This is stuff that I think about all the time. I think if I hadn't been writing a book about this, I still would have been turning it over in my head and perseverating on it, because I tend to perseverate on things. That's just kind of how my brain works. I have 2 dogs right now. I love them both very much. I think about them as my friends. I hope that they see me as their friend, but at the same time, it's not like I've given them an equal vote in everything that happens in the house. I'm still the one who's making the decisions, and those power dynamics are still in place. So, in terms of that, it hasn't. We haven't moved to a fully egalitarian society here in my household. I'm still on top, and they're still doing what I ask them to do for the most part.
Yeah, that's fair. So, and one of the interesting things in your previous book was that the these kind of like alien confederations that are kind of vying for absorbing different species, are often sort of exploiting the species that kind of join these federations, for like their cultural resources. And I feel like in the case of this novel, there's really not any of that. Like, the Greys don't seem to think that humanity had, and maybe I'm misremembering it, but like they don't seem like they didn't get the sense they had anything to offer. It was like, oh, we're just kind of, you're around, you basically, you're almost like on the kind of precipice of destruction, and we'll kind of just make you great little workers. Was that intentional? How did you, and also it would be presumably for a different story if they kind of thought about them exploiting it. But is presumably that kind of grew out of the fact that the Greys kind of think that they're like kind of providing a great gift to humanity. And they're kind of, and is that like a missed opportunity for the Greys? Is that one of these things where, I mean, going back to what we were talking about in terms of like human mediocrity, like, is there something to be said for actually recognizing your own mediocrity as a way of actually learning the best of others? And if you kind of don't have that sense of mediocrity, you actually don't have any opportunity for growth.
Yeah, that's a big blind spot for the Greys. And I put that in there deliberately. Martok, early on in the book, talks about this a little when he's in a car with Six and John. And he sort of hints that he's willing to admit that there might be some tiny aspects of human civilization that might have had some tiny amount of merit to them. And he says that makes him a bit of a heretic. To even admit that much makes him a little bit of a heretic to the other Greys. So it is definitely a blind spot on their part. I think it is, it's certainly true that we all have things to learn from one another. And if you think you've got everything figured out yourself, you probably are very much mistaken in that. And that's, like I said, in science fiction, we kind of hold up these mirrors to get people to look at themselves and think a little bit. And if reading something like that and you get kind of offended, you think everything about human society is garbage, makes you think, well, wait a minute, maybe the fact that I've been thinking about this other human culture as garbage is also wrong. Again, maybe I've done a little bit of good here.
Okay. No, I like that. And certainly, I mean, yeah, Mark Tuck's idea of creating a bed and breakfast, right? It seems like that's inspired by
yes,
by
stolen
humanity
directly from us. Yeah,
right. It's like, let's do this kind of thing. And I guess maybe for wrapping up, you leave the geography, like the geographical location of where the story is kind of taking place, very vague. Did you have kind of a map in mind of like where these things were, like where they are on Earth? Is that something you're willing to share, or this is just kind of, you're leaving it very vague?
Yeah. This is near my stomping grounds here, the sort of northern Great Lakes kind of area.
It felt very similar to kind of that kind of area, which I'm also familiar with. And but yeah, I wasn't sure. Okay, so that feels good. Anyway, no, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. It was a fun conversation.